A millionaire is saved by a poor boy during a disaster, but the boy disappears without explanation. Upon investigation, he discovers a connection between the boy and a family, his ambition ruined in the past. As his life falls apart, an old rival resurfaces with a plan to destroy him once and for all. Now he must race against time to save the boy and rebuild his own redemption. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching us from. Richard Montgomery gazed at the city from the top of his penthouse in the most luxurious building in Chicago. At 45, he commanded a real estate empire worth billions of dollars, built with iron determination and, as many whispered in corporate corridors, an absolute lack of scruples. His stern face, marked by piercing eyes and a perpetually tense jaw, reflected in the mirrored glass as he sipped his imported whiskey. Solitude didn't bother him. On the contrary, it was his natural state ever since he decided that genuine relationships were obstacles to success. His 8,000-square-foot apartment was decorated with the most sophisticated items in the world, but it was completely devoid of human warmth. There were no family photos, only expensive works of art that served more as investments than decorations. That Monday morning, Richard prepared for another week of negotiations and meetings. His personal driver was already waiting in the garage to take him to his first inspection of the day, the Aurora building, one of his oldest properties in the city center. The building was scheduled for a complete renovation, part of a revitalization project that would multiply its market value. "Mr. Montgomery, all the documents for the inspection are ready," informed Melissa, his personal assistant of over a decade, through the intercom. She was the only person who had managed to stay on his team for so long, perhaps because she had developed a shell as thick as her boss's. On the way to the city center, Richard barely glanced out the window of his armored car. His world was made of numbers, contracts, and negotiations. The people on the sidewalks were just statistics in his economic feasibility reports. While checking emails on his latest model smartphone, he completely ignored the contrast between his luxurious vehicle and the deteriorating streets of the old downtown. The Aurora building was a 1950s construction, with architecture that had once been imposing, but now showed clear signs of neglect. Richard had inherited the building in a shady deal 15 years ago, when a previous owner, deep in debt, had no choice but to accept his predatory offer. "Let's make this quick," he said as he stepped out of the car, adjusting his Italian tie. The engineer in charge of the inspection was already waiting at the entrance, accompanied by 2 technicians. Richard barely greeted the team, heading straight into the building. The smell of mold and abandonment was pungent. Richard wrinkled his nose as they climbed the stairs, since the elevator had been out of service for years. His complaints about the state of the place were constant, even though he himself was responsible for neglecting basic maintenance for so long. On the 4th floor, something caught his attention. A strange noise, as if the building's structure was groaning. The engineer also noticed it, abruptly stopping his explanation about the necessary renovations. "Is this normal?" asked Richard, for the first time showing a hint of concern in his always controlled voice. Before anyone could answer, a deafening roar filled the air. The floor beneath their feet began to tremble, and pieces of the ceiling started to fall. Panic set in instantly. "Everyone out, the building is collapsing," shouted the engineer. But it was too late. The floor between them split like paper, creating a chasm that separated Richard from the rest of the group. In a matter of seconds, he found himself isolated on a small stable area, while chaos erupted around him. The thick dust made it hard to see and breathe. Richard, for the first time in years, felt real fear. His empire of concrete and glass was literally crumbling beneath his feet. Trapped, he realized there was no escape route. The hallway in front of him had disappeared, and behind him, only rubble remained. It was in this moment of absolute despair that he heard a voice, childlike but firm. "Give me your hand," someone shouted through the cloud of dust. When Richard managed to focus his vision, he saw something that defied logic. A boy, no more than 12 years old, thin and poorly dressed, was balanced on an exposed beam, extending his hand toward him. His eyes, large and determined, conveyed a courage that contrasted with his fragile appearance. At any other moment in his life, Richard would have ignored that outstretched hand. He would have questioned the boy's presence, doubted his ability, refused to trust someone so insignificant in his eyes. But in that instant, suspended between life and chaos, his certainties crumbled along with the building. With no choice, Richard grabbed the boy's hand. With surprising strength, the boy guided him through the debris, finding a path that seemed impossible among exposed beams and chunks of concrete. Each step was a challenge, each movement could mean the end, but the boy moved with a disconcerting familiarity with the environment. When they finally reached a safe area, Richard was covered in dust, his Italian suit ruined, his magnate persona completely shattered. Coughing and trembling, he leaned against the nearest wall, trying to catch his breath and process what had just happened. But when he turned to thank or at least understand who his unlikely savior was, the boy had disappeared. On the ground, where the boy had been seconds before, there was only an old yellowed photograph. Richard picked it up with trembling hands, and his heart skipped a beat as he recognized the place depicted. It was another of his abandoned buildings, one he had completely forgotten in his portfolio of properties. Sirens began to wail in the distance, and voices of rescue approached. But Richard barely heard them. His eyes were fixed on the photograph, and his mind, for the first time in years, was focused on something beyond numbers and profits. Who was that boy? How had he been in the building? And why was he carrying a photo of another one of his properties? At that moment, still unaware, Richard Montgomery was about to embark on a journey that would change not only his life, but his very essence as a human being. The empire he had built would begin to reveal its cracks, far deeper than those in the Aurora building, and the price of the power he so valued would finally come due. Sitting in his corporate penthouse office 2 days after the incident, he watched the sensational headlines spreading across all news portals. Real estate tycoon miraculously survives building collapse. Boy hero saves businessman and disappears without a trace. Questions arise about Aurora building maintenance. Melissa entered the room carrying a stack of newspapers and magazines, all with variations of the same story. The chaos that followed the partial collapse of the Aurora building turned Richard Montgomery's meticulously controlled routine into a whirlwind. Social media is in an uproar, sir. People are speculating about the boy's identity, creating theories, sharing similar stories of neglect in other buildings near. Richard made an impatient gesture with his hand, dismissing the comments. His gaze was fixed on the photograph found after his rescue, now stored in a folder on his desk. The image showed the St. Vincent building, a property he had acquired over a decade ago at a judicial auction. He couldn't remember the details of the transaction, something unusual for someone who prided himself on his impeccable business memory. "I need you to pull up the entire history of the St. Vincent building," he ordered his assistant. "I want to know every detail of the acquisition, who the previous owners were, what process led to the auction, everything." Melissa made some notes on her tablet. "There are also dozens of interview requests, sir. The press wants your version of the rescue, the boy—" "Ignore them all," Richard cut her off, standing up to pour himself a glass of water. His hands, usually steady, trembled slightly as he held the crystal glass. "And call Carlos from security. I want the footage from the Aurora building's cameras from the past few days. I need to understand how that boy was inside." As Melissa left to carry out his orders, Richard turned his attention to his computer screen. There was something about the photograph that deeply disturbed him. It wasn't just the fact that it showed one of his forgotten properties, but something about the composition of the image, the way the building had been photographed, seemed to carry a subliminal message he couldn't decipher. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Frank Almeida, his lawyer of over 15 years. "Richard, we have a problem." Frank's usually calm voice sounded tense. "The district attorney's office is opening an investigation into the collapse. They want all the maintenance documents for the Aurora building from the past 5 years. "So? Everything should be in order," Richard replied, more out of habit than certainty. "That's the problem, it's not. I just reviewed the files and there are several irregularities. Ignored technical reports, warnings about structural issues filed without action, complaints from residents in the area about fragments falling from the facade." Richard felt a weight in his stomach. His policy had always been to maximize profits and minimize expenses, especially in old properties destined for real estate speculation. But now, that strategy was beginning to show its consequences. "Fix this, Frank. Use the contacts we have, do whatever it takes." "It's not that simple this time," the lawyer countered. The media is all over it. Social media won't stop sharing stories about your other buildings with similar issues. And there's more. Some internal documents about the Aurora building have started leaking online. The news hit Richard like a punch to the gut. Leaks were unacceptable in his organization. They meant someone with privileged access was deliberately sabotaging his company. At that moment, Melissa returned to the office, her normally impassive face showing concern. "Mr. Montgomery, I've found some preliminary information about the St. Vincent building. It belonged to the O'Connor family before the auction. And there's something you need to see." She placed an old yellowed folder on the table. Inside were newspaper clippings from 15 years ago, reporting on the process that led to the building's sale. The headlines spoke of a bitter legal dispute, with accusations of document manipulation and pressure on the owners. "The patriarch of the O'Connor family was Michael O'Connor," Melissa continued hesitantly. He tried to stop the auction until the last moment, claiming irregularities in the process. 3 months after the sale, he and his wife mysteriously disappeared, leaving a young son. Richard felt his blood run cold. The date of the disappearance coincided with the time when his company began its most aggressive expansion in the real estate market. He vaguely remembered tense meetings, documents signed in haste, a special file that his then-partner, Alexander Mills, had assured him he would handle personally. "What was the son's name?" he asked, dreading the answer. "Daniel O'Connor," Melissa replied, handing over an old photo. "He was 4 years old at the time. This is the only photo I could find of him." Richard took the photograph with trembling hands. The smiling face of the child, standing with his parents in front of the St. Vincent building, seemed to mock his newly awakened conscience. The same determined eyes that had stared at him during the rescue now gazed at him from the past, filled with an innocence that time had surely destroyed. The phone rang again, but Richard didn't answer. His mind was immersed in a whirlwind of suppressed memories, questionable decisions and consequences that were now coming back to haunt him. The boy who had saved his life wasn't a random guardian angel. He was the son of people whose lives Richard had directly impacted, even if he couldn't remember the details. The photograph of the St. Vincent building, left deliberately after the rescue, wasn't just a coincidence. It was a message, a reminder of a past he had tried to bury under layers of success and power. And now that past was emerging from the rubble, bringing with it truths that threatened to destroy everything he had built. The week that followed turned Richard Montgomery's life into a growing nightmare. His empire, built so carefully over decades, was beginning to show cracks that went far beyond the incident at the Aurora building. Every hour a new revelation emerged, like pieces of a macabre puzzle fitting together to form a picture he didn't want to see. In his office, now transformed into an improvised bunker against the media storm, Richard analyzed the documents Melissa had managed to gather about the O'Connor family. The information was fragmented, as if someone had deliberately erased important parts of the story. But what remained was enough to keep him awake at night. "Mr. Montgomery," Melissa entered the room hurriedly, interrupting his thoughts. "American Construct just cancelled the partnership contract for the business complex project in the South Zone." Richard looked up from the documents, incredulous. "What do you mean cancelled?" "We have a bulletproof contract. Investments already made, they can't just—" "They can," Melissa interrupted, handing him a tablet with the official statement. "The social responsibility clause in the contract allows for cancellation in case of proven negligence in other projects. They specifically cite the Aurora building case." The businessman felt his stomach sink. American Construct was just the first partner to jump ship, he knew. Others would follow, like rats fleeing a sinking ship. His reputation, built so carefully, was crumbling faster than the Aurora building itself. "There's one more thing," Melissa continued hesitantly. "I found something strange in the old records. In 2009, exactly around the time of the O'Connors' disappearance, there was a significant transfer to an account in the Cayman Islands. The beneficiary was coded, but—" "Alexander," Richard murmured, a name he hadn't spoken in years. "Alexander Mills." Alexander had been his partner in the early years of the company's expansion. A brilliant businessman, but with methods that even Richard, known for his ruthlessness, considered extreme. They had parted ways in a turbulent disagreement over business practices, and Alexander had disappeared off the radar, taking with him secrets Richard had preferred to bury in the past. "I need you to find Alexander. he ordered his assistant. Use all necessary resources. He must know something about what happened to the O'Connors. At that moment, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. When he opened it, he felt his blood run cold. It was an old photo, showing him and Alexander in a meeting with Michael O'Connor. The caption read simply, "Some debts never expire." "Melissa, call Frank now," he ordered, his voice betraying an unusual urgency. "And try to locate any distant relatives of the O'Connors. Someone must know where that boy is." As he waited, Richard turned his attention to the news online. Social media was buzzing with theories about the mysterious boy, now dubbed the Angel of the Rubble by the press. Some described him as a guardian, sent to expose the injustices of the real estate market. Others speculated about his true identity. Frank arrived in less than an hour, carrying a thick folder of documents. His normally serene face was marked by concern. "Things are getting worse, Richard," he announced without preamble. "The district attorney's office just issued a subpoena. They want to investigate not just the Aurora building, but all your projects from the past 15 years. And there's more. Someone is systematically leaking internal documents to the press." Richard showed him the photo he had received on his phone. Frank paled at the image. "That was on the day the agreement was signed," the lawyer murmured. "The agreement Alexander said would solve everything." "What agreement, Frank?" Richard asked, his voice laced with a veiled threat. The lawyer hesitated, running a hand over his tired face. "Alexander presented a proposal to Michael O'Connor. If he dropped his challenge to the auction, he'd receive a generous compensation, but Michael refused. He said the building was a family heirloom, that it wasn't for sale at any price. And then, Alexander said he'd handle the situation. You were focused on the expansion into the interior, left the details to him. A few weeks later, documents surfaced, proving the St. Vincent building had serious structural issues. The value plummeted, the auction was forced, and the O'Connors disappeared," Richard completed, feeling the weight of each word. At that moment, Melissa returned to the office, her normally composed face showing signs of agitation. "Sir, I found something. A social worker who handled the boy's case after his parents' disappearance. She stayed in contact with him for years, until he also disappeared from the system a few months ago. Where is she? I need to talk to her immediately." "That's the problem," Melissa replied. "She now works at a non-profit supporting underprivileged children. And guess who the non-profit's main funder is?" "Alexander Mills," Richard answered, the pieces starting to fall into place. The web was more complex than he had imagined. The boy, Daniel O'Connor, wasn't acting alone. There was a greater force behind it all, orchestrating each move with surgical precision, and at the center of this web was Alexander Mills, the man who knew all his secrets, all his vulnerabilities. Richard looked out the window of his office, observing the city he had long considered his personal kingdom. Now every building seemed to hide an unresolved story, every past deal a ticking time bomb. And somewhere out there, a boy who should hate him had chosen to save him, only to set off a chain of events that threatened to destroy everything he had built. The question that tormented him was no longer just about finding Daniel, but understanding why the boy had saved him. What was the true purpose behind that act of mercy? And more importantly, what was Alexander Mills planning to do with all the pieces he had so carefully moved over the years? The morning arrived grey and oppressive, as if the sky itself shared the weight Richard Montgomery carried. He hadn't slept, his red eyes fixed on the computer screen all night, scouring every piece of information that could lead him to Daniel O'Connor or Alexander Mills. The strong coffee in his cup, his third since dawn, was already cold and forgotten. A soft knock on the door announced Melissa's arrival. She entered quietly, observing her boss's deplorable state before speaking. "Mr. Montgomery, the security team finished analyzing the Aurora building's camera footage," she said, placing a flash drive on the table. "There's something you need to see." Richard connected the device to the computer with trembling fingers. The images were grainy, typical of old security cameras, but clear enough to show the truth. 3 days before the collapse, a small, agile figure was sneaking through the building's abandoned hallways. It was Daniel, no doubt. The boy seemed to know every corner, every hiding spot, moving with the familiarity of someone who had frequented the place for a long time. "He was looking for something," Richard murmured, more to himself than to Melissa. "But what?" The footage showed Daniel entering and leaving the building at different times, always carrying a worn backpack. In one scene, the boy stopped in front of a wall, feeling it as if searching for something hidden. The date in the corner of the screen indicated this had happened the day before the collapse. "We need to go there," Richard said, standing abruptly. "Now." "But sir, the site is cordoned off by the forensics team. We can't just—" "Find a way," Richard cut her off, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Use my contacts at City Hall. Bribe whoever you need to, but get me inside that building in an hour." As Melissa left to carry out his orders, Richard turned his attention to the files about the O'Connor family. Something in the financial reports caught his eye. A series of small but consistent transactions made to an account in the name of the New Dawn Foundation. The transfers had started shortly after Michael and his wife disappeared. A quick online search revealed that the New Dawn Foundation was, in fact, the non-profit where the social worker who had cared for Daniel was employed. The same non-profit funded by Alexander Mills. "What are you planning, Alexander?" Richard murmured, feeling the gears of a larger conspiracy moving around him. An hour later, as ordered, Richard stood before the ruins of the Aurora building. The site was cordoned off with caution tape and warning signs, but Melissa had managed, through means he preferred not to question, to secure temporary authorization for an emergency inspection. Equipped with a helmet and safety vest, Richard entered the partially collapsed building. The smell of dust and damp concrete filled his nostrils, bringing back vivid memories of his near-death experience. Each step was cautious, the sound of debris shifting under his feet echoing ominously through the empty hallways. Guided by the security camera footage etched in his memory, Richard made his way to the spot where Daniel had been seen feeling the wall. The section was relatively intact, protected by the fall of a beam that had created an improvised shelter. With slightly trembling hands, Richard began examining the wall. His fingers traced the rough surface, searching for any irregularities. After several minutes of fruitless searching, he felt something, a small protrusion almost imperceptible. He pressed it firmly, and to his surprise, a section of the wall moved, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a metal box, the size of a large book. Richard picked it up carefully, feeling the weight of the secrets it likely held. When he opened it, he found a series of old documents, some already yellowed with age. At the top of the pile was a photo. Alexander Mills and Michael O'Connor shaking hands, tense smiles on their faces. The date on the back was just a few days before the O'Connors' disappearance. But what really caught his attention was an envelope addressed to him, in handwriting he immediately recognized as Alexander's. With trembling fingers, he opened the envelope and began to read. "Richard, if you're reading this, it means the game has begun. You've always been good at building empires, but terrible at seeing what was happening in the foundations. This is your chance to correct the mistakes of the past or to sink with them. The choice, as always, is yours. The boy is the key. Find him before it's too late." A.M. The sound of footsteps echoing through the hallways interrupted his reading. Richard hastily stuffed the letter and documents into his jacket, leaving the empty box in the hiding spot. He turned toward the exit, his mind a whirlwind of unanswered questions. As he emerged from the building, the daylight momentarily blinded him. When his eyes adjusted, he saw a familiar figure standing by his car, Frank, his lawyer, with a grave expression on his face. "We have a problem," Frank said without preamble. "The police just issued a search and seizure warrant for all your offices and residences. They're looking for evidence of fraud and criminal negligence." Richard felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. The empire he had built was about to be scrutinized, every secret exposed, every decision questioned, and in his pocket, the newly discovered documents weighed like lead, connecting him to a web of events he was only beginning to understand. "What do we do now?" Frank asked, his voice betraying unusual nervousness. Richard looked once more at the ruins of the Aurora building, then at the city stretching to the horizon. Somewhere out there, Daniel O'Connor held the answers he needed, and Alexander Mills was moving the pieces of a game whose rules Richard still didn't understand. "Now," he said, his voice finding a determination he hadn't felt in days. "We find the boy, and we uncover the truth, no matter the cost." As he got into the car, Richard knew he was about to dive into waters far deeper and more turbulent than he had ever imagined. The game, as Alexander had said, had indeed begun, and the stakes were higher than any deal he had ever made in his life. Frank's law office, located on the 20th floor of a commercial building in the heart of Chicago's financial district, became the unlikely headquarters for Richard Montgomery. The blinds were drawn, plunging the room into a dimness that matched the mood of those present. Richard, Frank, and Melissa formed an unlikely trio, united by the urgency to unravel a mystery that deepened with each passing hour. "The police just left your penthouse," Melissa informed, hanging up the phone. "They took computers, documents, even your personal safe." Richard nodded silently, his eyes fixed on the documents he had found in the Aurora building. Each page seemed to contain a new secret, a new connection that took him deeper into the labyrinth of his own past. "This doesn't make sense," Frank murmured, analyzing a contract dated 15 years ago. "This document shows that the ownership of the St. Vincent building was transferred to an offshore company in the Cayman Islands, even before the judicial auction." "How is that possible?" "Alexander," Richard replied, his voice laced with a mix of anger and regret. "He was always the master of creating complex corporate structures. He must have manipulated the process from the beginning." "But why?" Melissa questioned. "What would be the purpose of such an elaborate scheme?" Richard stood up, walking to the window. Through a crack in the blinds, he could see the city he had long considered his personal domain. Now every building seemed to hide a secret, every street a potential trap. "This isn't just about money or properties," he said finally. "Alexander is playing a much more complex game, and somehow the boy Daniel is at the center of it all." At that moment, Melissa's phone rang. She answered quickly, her expression changing from curiosity to surprise as she listened. "Sir," she said, hanging up, "it was one of my contacts in social services. They've located an address associated with Daniel O'Connor. It's a shelter for minors on the outskirts of the city." Richard didn't hesitate. "Let's go there now." The journey to the shelter was tense. Richard watched the streets pass by the car window, noticing for the first time the stark contrasts of the city. They left the opulence of the financial district and plunged into increasingly impoverished neighborhoods, where abandoned buildings and makeshift communities told a very different story from the one he was used to seeing. The shelter was a simple building, painted in faded blue with bars on the windows and a small courtyard in front. As they approached, Richard noticed suspicious movement. A boy, whom he immediately recognized as Daniel, was hurrying out the back of the building. "There!" he shouted, pointing. Frank, who was driving, quickly maneuvered, pulling over abruptly. Richard didn't wait for the car to stop completely before jumping out, running in the direction of the boy. "Daniel!" he called, his voice echoing through the narrow streets. The boy looked back, his eyes widening as he recognized Richard. For a moment he seemed to hesitate as if considering stopping, but then with surprising agility, he darted down the street, disappearing into a maze of alleys and dead ends. Richard followed him, ignoring the protests of Frank and Melissa. His heart raced, not just from the physical exertion, but from the emotion of being so close to unraveling the mystery. He turned one corner, then another, always keeping Daniel in sight. Finally, after a frantic chase, they reached a dead end. Daniel was cornered, pressed against a wall of worn bricks. His breathing was heavy, and his eyes, the same ones Richard had seen during the rescue at the Aurora building, were filled with a mix of fear and defiance. "Please," Richard said, trying to catch his breath, "I just want to talk." Daniel stared at him for long seconds before speaking. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice surprisingly firm for someone so young. "It's not safe." "Safe for who?" Richard questioned, taking a step forward. "For me or for you?" The boy looked nervously over Richard's shoulder, as if expecting someone to arrive at any moment. "For neither of us," he finally replied. "They're watching. They always have been." "Who? Alexander?" At the mention of the name, Daniel visibly paled. "You don't understand," he murmured. "This is much bigger than you think. I shouldn't have saved you that day." "But I couldn't let you. I couldn't." His voice faltered, and for the first time Richard saw in him not the mysterious savior, but a frightened boy, carrying a burden far greater than he should. "Daniel," Richard said, his voice softening, "I know about your parents. I know what happened to the St. Vincent building. Please help me understand. What is Alexander planning?" The boy hesitated, seeming to wage an internal battle. Finally, with a deep sigh, he said, "It's not just about Alexander. It's about an entire system. Corruption, lies, destroyed lives. And you're part of it all, even if you don't know it. At that moment, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the alley. Frank and Melissa finally caught up, out of breath. "Richard," Frank shouted, "we need to get out of here. The police are on their way. Someone tipped them off." Panic took over Daniel. "Go away," he shouted. "They can't see me with you." Richard looked from Daniel to his companions, feeling the weight of the decision he needed to make. Leaving the boy behind meant losing his best chance to understand what was happening. But taking him by force would not only be illegal, it could destroy any chance of gaining his trust. "Daniel," he said, making a sudden decision, "come with us. I promise I'll protect you. Together, we can uncover the truth and fix what's been broken." The boy looked at him, indecision clear in his eyes. For a tense moment, the world seemed to freeze. The distant sound of sirens broke the silence, forcing a decision. With a quick movement, Daniel pulled something from his pocket, an old key, and tossed it to Richard. "P.O. Box 1547 at the Central Post Office," he said hurriedly. "There you'll find the next step. But be careful, Mr. Montgomery. Not everything is as it seems." Before Richard could react, Daniel leaped with surprising agility, scaling a nearby fire escape and disappearing over the rooftops. "Let's go," Frank urged, pulling Richard by the arm. As they ran back to the car, Richard's mind raced. The key in his hand seemed to weigh a ton, laden with promises and threats. The game had changed once again, and he knew that each step from that moment would take him deeper into a labyrinth of secrets and betrayals. As the car sped through the streets of the outskirts, leaving behind the echo of sirens, Richard looked at the key in his hand. It represented not just the next step in his quest, but a choice. A choice between continuing to live in the comfortable ignorance he had built for himself, or diving headfirst into the truth, no matter how painful it might be. With his heart racing and his mind filled with new questions, Richard knew there was no turning back. The path ahead was uncertain and dangerous, but it was the only one that could lead him to redemption, not just for himself, but for all those who had been affected by his actions over the years. The Central Post Office, an imposing Art Deco building in the heart of the city, was bustling with activity that Wednesday morning. Richard Montgomery, dressed discreetly, jeans, a t-shirt and a worn cap, an attempt to blend in, mingled with the crowd, his eyes constantly scanning the environment for familiar or suspicious faces. Beside him, Melissa murmured instructions through an almost imperceptible earpiece. "P.O. Box 1547 is in the third aisle to the right. Remember, be quick and don't draw attention." Richard nodded discreetly, feeling the weight of the key in his pocket. Each step toward the P.O. box seemed to amplify the sound of his heartbeat. What would he find there? More pieces of the puzzle that Alexander and Daniel had created, or just another dead end? Locating the box, he inserted the key with slightly trembling hands. The metallic click of the lock opening sounded like thunder in his ears. Inside, a single manila envelope, unmarked and unaddressed. Quickly stashing the envelope in his jacket, Richard made his way back, fighting the urge to run. Only when he was safely in the car with Frank at the wheel did he allow himself to breathe a sigh of relief. "What's inside?" Frank asked, eager. "Let's find out," Richard replied, carefully tearing open the envelope. The contents were surprisingly simple, a single sheet of paper with geographic coordinates and a date, 2 days from that moment. "Coordinates to where?" Melissa questioned, quickly typing them into her tablet. After a few seconds of processing, the answer appeared on the screen. A remote area on the outskirts of the city, known for its old abandoned farms. "Looks like we have a meeting," Richard murmured, his mind already mapping out possible scenarios. The rest of the day and the next were dedicated to meticulous preparations. Richard, Frank, and Melissa transformed the law office's conference room into an improvised operations center. Maps of the region were spread out, escape routes planned, and communication equipment tested. "I don't like this," Frank declared for the umpteenth time. "It could be a trap. Alexander has always been unpredictable, and now we have this mysterious boy in the mix." Richard, looking out the window at the city he once considered his uncontested kingdom, replied with a voice filled with determination, "We have no choice. Every minute that passes, we lose ground. The police are closing in. The press isn't letting up, and I have a feeling there's more at stake here than just my reputation or fortune." On the morning of the meeting, the trio set out before dawn. The path to the indicated location was tortuous, winding through secondary roads and trails almost erased by time. The urban landscape gradually gave way to open fields and eventually a region of gentle hills dotted with old abandoned structures. When they arrived at the exact coordinates, they found themselves facing an old barn. The structure, though weathered by time, still stood, its grey boards silently telling the story of decades of neglect. "Stay alert," Richard instructed, getting out of the car. "Any sign of danger, we leave immediately." With cautious steps, he approached the barn's entrance. The door, partially open, creaked ominously as he pushed it. The interior was bathed in dim light, with beams of sunlight piercing through the cracks between the boards. "Hello?" Richard called, his voice echoing in the empty space. For a moment, only silence answered. Then a familiar voice cut through the air. "You took your time getting here, Richard." From the shadows emerged the figure of Alexander Mills. Older than Richard remembered, with greying hair and deep lines on his face, but still exuding the same aura of confidence and danger that had always characterized him. "Alexander," Richard said, his voice a mix of relief and apprehension. "Finally we meet." "Yes," Alexander replied, an enigmatic smile playing on his lips. "Though, if it were up to you, this meeting would never have happened, would it?" Richard took a step forward, thousands of questions bubbling in his mind. "Why all this game, Alexander? What do you want?" "What do I want?" Alexander repeated, his voice laden with an emotion Richard couldn't decipher. "I want justice, Richard. Justice for all the lives we destroyed in our quest for power and wealth." "We?" Richard questioned, feeling a pang of indignation. "You disappeared years ago, taking with you—" "Taking what?" Alexander interrupted, his voice now sharp as a blade. "Money, secrets, guilt? Yes, I took all that. But you, my dear ex-partner, you kept the biggest prize, the illusion of innocence." At that moment, a movement in the shadows caught Richard's attention. Daniel emerged slowly, positioning himself beside Alexander. "Daniel," Richard whispered, understanding beginning to form in his mind. "You've been with him all along." The boy nodded, his eyes revealing a mix of fear and determination. "He found me after my parents, after they disappeared. He told me the truth about what happened to my family, to so many other families." Alexander placed a protective hand on Daniel's shoulder. "I've spent the last years unearthing every skeleton we buried, Richard, every dirty deal, every ruined life. And now it's time to settle the score." "What do you mean by that?" Richard asked, feeling a chill down his spine. "I want you to confess," Alexander replied, his voice now calm, almost gentle. "Confess everything. The bribes, the manipulations, the convenient accidents, including what happened to Daniel's parents." Richard felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. Long-suppressed memories began to emerge, secret meetings, forged documents, veiled threats, and at the center of it all, the terrified face of Michael O'Connor the last time he saw him. I don't know what happened to his parents," Richard said, his voice almost a whisper. "I swear I don't." "But you knew something would happen," Alexander pressed. "You gave the green light to handle the problem, didn't you?" The silence that followed was deafening. Richard looked at Daniel, seeing in those young eyes the reflection of all the lives he had affected in his relentless pursuit of success. "Yes," he finally admitted, feeling as if each word tore a piece of his soul. "I knew something would be done. I allowed it to happen." Alexander nodded gravely. "And now, Richard, you have a choice to make. You can keep denying, fighting against the tide that's about to swallow you, or you can do the right thing, perhaps for the first time in your life." "What's the right thing?" Richard asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Tell the truth," Alexander replied. "To the police, to the press, to the world. Expose everything we did, everything you kept doing after I left. It's the only way to start fixing what we broke." Richard looked from Alexander to Daniel, then to the barn door, where he knew Frank and Melissa were anxiously waiting. His mind spun with the implications of what he was about to decide. Exposing the truth would mean the end of everything he had built, the complete destruction of his empire and reputation. But as he looked again at Daniel, at those eyes that had saved him from the rubble, only to launch him on a journey of self-discovery and redemption, Richard felt something he hadn't experienced in years: clarity. "I'll do it," he said finally, his voice firm despite the whirlwind of emotions. "I'll tell everything." Alexander smiled, not a smile of triumph, but of relief. "Then let's begin," he said, pulling a recorder from his pocket. From the beginning. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the cracks of the old barn, Richard Montgomery began his confession. Word by word, deal by deal, he unearthed the secrets and lies that had sustained his empire. And with each revelation, he felt a weight lifting from his shoulders, replaced by something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. The journey that had begun in the rubble of a collapsing building was far from over. But there in that forgotten barn, surrounded by ghosts of the past and promises of an uncertain future, Richard took the first step toward redemption. The sun had barely risen when the first police cars arrived at Richard Montgomery's mansion. The sound of sirens cut through the morning silence, echoing through the empty halls of the house that had once been a symbol of power and luxury. Now it seemed like just an empty shell, holding the last remnants of a life built on lies. Richard watched the activity from the window of his office, his hands slightly trembling as he held an untouched cup of coffee. Beside him, Frank tried, for the umpteenth time, to convince him to reconsider. "There's still time," the lawyer insisted, his voice filled with concern. "We can claim coercion, say you were under extreme stress. You don't have to throw everything away like this." Richard turned slowly, facing his friend and confidant of so many years. His eyes, once always calculating and cold, now showed a mix of weariness and determination. "No, Frank," he replied, his voice surprisingly firm. "No more lies, no more schemes. It's time to face the consequences." The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted the conversation. Melissa entered the office, her normally impassive face now marked by anxiety. "They're here," she announced. "Detective Rodriguez is leading the operation personally." Richard nodded, placing the cup on the table. "Let's greet them then." Descending the mansion stairs, Richard felt the weight of every decision that had brought him here. Every shady deal, every life affected by his greed, all seemed to converge on this moment. When he opened the front door, he was met by the stern gaze of Detective Rodriguez. "Richard Montgomery," the detective said, his grave voice echoing in the entrance hall. "You're under arrest for questioning. We have a warrant to search all your properties." Richard extended his wrists, allowing the handcuffs to be placed. The metallic click seemed to seal the end of an era. "I have a full confession to make, Detective," Richard said, surprising everyone present. "About everything." The hours that followed were a whirlwind. Richard was taken to the police station where, in the presence of his lawyer and public prosecutors, he began to unravel the web of corruption, fraud, and crimes that had sustained his empire for so many years. Each word seemed to cost him a piece of his soul, but it also brought with it a strange sense of relief. Meanwhile, the news spread like wildfire. Journalists crowded outside the police station. Sensational headlines popped up on every news portal. "Real estate tycoon confesses corruption scheme. Montenegro empire crumbles. Years of fraud come to light." In the interrogation room, Richard spared no one, not even himself. He spoke about bribes to city inspectors, to ignore irregularities in his constructions, about the manipulation of bids, about veiled threats to competitors, and, most painfully, about his knowledge and complicity in the disappearance of Daniel's parents. "I didn't give the order directly," he confessed, his voice choked. "But I knew something would be done to handle the problem. I turned a blind eye, convinced myself it was just business. But it was a life, a family." Detective Rodriguez, who had started the interrogation with skepticism, now listened with a mix of shock and reluctant respect for Richard's brutal honesty. Outside the station, chaos erupted in the corporate world. Stocks of companies linked to the Montgomery Group plummeted on the stock market. Business partners rushed to publicly dissociate themselves, and a flood of lawsuits began to be filed by former employees and wronged clients. Melissa, still free, coordinated a crisis team from Frank's office. Her loyalty to Richard, built over years, was now tested to the limit. Part of her wanted to flee, abandon the sinking ship, but something kept her there, fighting to minimize the damage and protect what could be saved. At the end of that first day of confessions, Richard was taken to a cell. Alone for the first time in hours, he sat on the edge of the narrow bed. The contrast with the luxury he was accustomed to couldn't be more striking. He closed his eyes, letting the memories flood him. the terrified face of Michael O'Connor, the determined gaze of Daniel on the day of the rescue, Alexander's expression of disappointment as he revealed the truth in the barn. A guard approached the bars, interrupting his thoughts. "Montgomery, you have a visitor." Richard looked up, surprised, wondering who it could be. Perhaps Frank with some legal news, or Melissa with updates on the chaos his confession had unleashed. But when the door to the visitation room opened, his heart almost stopped. It was Daniel. The boy entered hesitantly, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Richard. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of the past and the uncertainties of the future hanging between them. "Why are you here?" Richard finally asked, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. Daniel took a few steps forward, stopping a few feet from the table that separated them. I needed to understand," he replied, his voice a mix of confusion and determination. "Why did you decide to tell the truth? Why now?" Richard looked at his shackled hands, then back at the boy. In that moment, he saw not just the son of people he had harmed, but a living reminder of all the lives his actions had affected. "Because it was the right thing to do," he replied simply. "Because you showed me that there was still a chance to do something right, even if it's too late." Daniel nodded slowly, processing the words. "My parents," he began hesitantly. "Do you really not know what happened to them?" Richard felt the weight of guilt pressing on his chest. "I don't know the details, Daniel, and that's one of the things that torment me the most. But I promise you, I'll do everything in my power to uncover the truth. You deserve that. Your parents deserve that." A heavy silence settled between them. Daniel seemed to wage an internal battle, torn between the anger accumulated over years and something new, perhaps a glimmer of understanding. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he said finally. "But thank you for telling the truth. It's a start." As Daniel turned to leave, Richard felt a sudden impulse. "Daniel!" he called, making the boy stop at the door. "Thank you for saving me that day. Not just from the rubble, but from myself." The boy looked at him one last time, a half-smile almost imperceptible on his lips, before disappearing through the door. Alone again, Richard leaned back in the chair, feeling the weight of years of lies and the paradoxical relief of the truth. The path ahead would be long and difficult, filled with judgments, both in the courts and in the court of public opinion. His empire was in ruins, his reputation destroyed. But for the first time in decades, Richard Montgomery felt he was on the right path. Redemption, he realized, wouldn't come from a single confession or act of contrition. It would be a long and arduous journey, filled with challenges and sacrifices. But now, with the truth as his compass, he was ready to face whatever came. As night fell over the city he once dominated, Richard closed his eyes, allowing himself a moment of peace. Tomorrow would be another day, the first of many in his quest for redemption. And no matter how difficult the path, he would walk it to the end. The weeks that followed Richard Montgomery's confession were a whirlwind of events that shook not just Chicago, but the entire country. The Montgomery case, as it came to be known, triggered a series of investigations that exposed a complex web of corruption involving politicians, businessmen, and high-ranking public officials. In his cell at the medium-security prison, Richard followed the developments through newspapers and Frank's regular visits. Each new headline, each name exposed, was like a piece of a giant puzzle he had helped assemble over the years, and now watched crumble. "The mayor has been indicted this morning," Frank informed during a visit. "Today it seems that the land in the city center, the one for the shopping mall project, was cleared through bribery." Richard nodded, remembering the negotiation. At the time, it had seemed like just another business facilitator. Now, every past decision took on a moral weight he had never considered before. Meanwhile, in the streets, the mood was one of outrage and hope. Popular protests demanded justice and transparency. Signs with Richard's face were raised, not as a symbol of success, as before, but as an emblem of a corrupt system that needed to be dismantled. At the Montgomery mansion, now practically empty and under constant surveillance, Melissa coordinated efforts to cooperate with the investigations. Boxes and more boxes of documents were handed over to the authorities, each potentially containing evidence of another scheme, another fraud. "I found something," she told Frank during one of their daily meetings. "An encrypted file on Richard's personal server. I need his authorization to access it." Frank made a mental note, promising to address the issue during his next visit to the prison. Each day new revelations emerged, and he wondered when they would hit rock bottom. Meanwhile, in a modest apartment in the city's suburbs, Alexander Mills and Daniel watched the developments with a mix of satisfaction and apprehension. "It's happening faster than we imagined," Alexander commented, his eyes fixed on the television showing another police operation in progress. Daniel, sitting on the worn couch, hugged his knees to his chest. "Do you think they'll find out what happened to my parents?" Alexander turned to the boy, his expression softening. "We're closer than ever, Daniel. I promise I won't give up until we have all the answers." At the prison, Richard faced his own demons. The nights were long, haunted by nightmares in which faces from the past accused him. Voices whispered his failures, and buildings collapsed on him. He woke up sweating, the reality of his current situation not much better than the dreams that tormented him. It was during one of these sleepless nights that Richard made a decision. The next morning, when Frank arrived for another visit, he greeted him with renewed determination in his eyes. "I need to talk to Alexander," he declared, surprising the lawyer. Frank hesitated. "Richard, I'm not sure that's a good idea, legally speaking." "This isn't about legality now, Frank," Richard interrupted. "There are things only Alexander knows, pieces of this puzzle that are missing. We need him to complete the story." After much insistence and some legal maneuvering by Frank, the meeting was arranged. Days later, Alexander Mills entered the prison's visitation room, his face a mask of neutrality that didn't reveal the turbulent emotions beneath. "You look terrible," Alexander commented, sitting across from Richard. "Prison does that to people," Richard replied, an ironic smile playing on his lips. "But I'm not here to talk about me. We need to talk about the O'Connors." The name hung between them, laden with shared meaning and guilt. Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying the man in front of him. The Richard he had known, always impeccable and controlled, had given way to someone more human, more vulnerable. "What do you want to know?" Alexander finally asked. "Everything," Richard replied. "What really happened that night? Who gave the final order? And more importantly, is there any chance they're still alive?" Alexander sighed deeply, as if the weight of years of secrets finally crushed him. "The truth, Richard, is that even I don't know all the details, but I know who does." He then began to tell about an old contact in the underworld, someone they used to use to handle problems in the early years of the company's rise. This man, known only as the broker, was the missing link between the decisions made in the boardrooms and the dark actions that followed. "He disappeared right after the incident with the O'Connors," Alexander explained. "I thought he'd been eliminated to tie up loose ends. But recently, I've received indications that he's still out there." Richard leaned forward, his eyes shining with a mix of hope and determination. "We need to find him. He's our best chance to discover what really happened, and perhaps to give Daniel the answers he deserves." Alexander nodded slowly. "It won't be easy. He has powerful connections, people who don't want these old stories to come to light." "I don't care how difficult it is," Richard declared. "I've lost everything, Alexander. My freedom, my reputation, my empire. The only thing I have left is the chance to do something right, to fix at least a part of the harm we caused." The two ex-partners stared at each other, years of shared history, betrayals and regrets passing silently between them. Finally, Alexander extended his hand. "Let's do this together then," he said. "For Daniel, and for all the others we harmed along the way." Richard shook the offered hand, feeling that for the first time in a long time, he was truly on the right path. The search for the broker wouldn't just be a hunt for answers, but a journey of redemption for both of them. As the guards indicated the end of the visit, Richard and Alexander exchanged a final look of understanding. The game had changed once again, but now they were on the same side. The truth, no matter how painful, was the only way forward. That night, in his cell, Richard slept without nightmares for the first time in weeks. The path ahead was still long and uncertain, but there was a light at the end of the tunnel. A light that promised not just answers, but also the possibility of redemption. The search for the mysterious broker proved to be a much greater challenge than Richard and Alexander had initially imagined. Weeks passed, and the only thing that grew was the list of dead ends and informants who mysteriously disappeared before providing any concrete leads. Richard, still confined in his cell, felt more powerless than ever. His only connection to the outside world were Frank's visits and the encrypted letters Alexander managed to send, disguised as legal correspondence. One particularly stifling afternoon, Frank arrived for another visit, his face laden with concern. "Things are getting complicated out there, Richard," he said, sitting at the visitation table. "The investigation is expanding. Now they're looking into international transactions, offshore accounts. They're following the money." Richard nodded gravely. He knew it was only a matter of time before the authorities discovered the true extent of his financial network. "And Melissa, how is she handling all this?" Frank hesitated for a moment. "She's under a lot of pressure. The investigators interrogated her several times last week, but she's holding her ground, following the cooperation plan we established." What Frank didn't mention was Melissa's emotional state. The assistant, always so composed and efficient, was showing signs of wear. Sleepless nights, reviewing documents and trying to anticipate the investigators' next moves were taking their toll. Meanwhile, in a busy cafe in the city center, Alexander met with Daniel. The boy who once lived in the shadows had now become an almost mythical figure to the media. The boy who saved the corrupt tycoon, only to help expose his crimes. "Have they found anything about my parents?" Daniel asked, his voice barely disguising his anxiety. Alexander shook his head. "Not yet, but we're getting closer. Every lead we follow takes us a little deeper into this web." What Alexander didn't tell Daniel was about the veiled threats he had started to receive. Anonymous messages, accidental encounters with shadowy figures advising him to leave the past in the past. The noose was tightening not just around Richard and his former associates, but also around those seeking the truth. Back at the prison, Richard spent hours studying every document Frank could bring, every piece of information Alexander sent. In his mind, a complex map began to form, connecting seemingly unrelated events, obscure financial transactions, and mysterious disappearances. It was during one of these study sessions that something caught his attention, a name that appeared repeatedly in minor transactions, almost imperceptible if not analyzed together: John Marks. "Frank," Richard called during his next visit, "I need you to investigate someone for me. John Marks. Something tells me he might be the key to finding the broker." The lawyer made a note, promising to look into it. Little did he know that this simple name would trigger a series of events that would change the course of the entire investigation. Days later, Melissa was in her improvised office at the Montgomery mansion when she received an anonymous call. The voice on the other end was distorted, but the message was clear. The encrypted file on Richard's personal server. "The password is Aurora 1999. You'll find what you're looking for there." With trembling hands, Melissa accessed the server. The file, protected for years, finally opened before her eyes. What she saw made her gasp: a detailed list of transactions, names, and dates. At the top of the list, in bold, Operation Phoenix, John Marks, broker. Meanwhile, Alexander followed his own line of investigation. One of his old contacts finally caved and arranged a meeting at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. When he arrived at the location, Alexander felt a shiver run down his spine. The place was too quiet. "I thought you'd never come, Mr. Mills," a voice echoed in the empty space. Alexander turned, facing a middle-aged man, graying hair and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 secrets. He recognized him immediately from old photos: John Marks, the broker. "You're a hard man to find," Alexander said, trying to maintain his composure. Marks gave a humorless smile. "That's my job. Or was until you started digging up the past. We need to know the truth about the O'Connors," Alexander declared. "What really happened that night?" The broker sighed deeply, as if finally surrendering to the weight of years of secrets. "The truth, Mr. Mills, is much more complicated than you imagine. The O'Connors, they didn't die that night." Alexander felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. "What?" "But then, they were relocated," Marks continued, "part of a larger deal, involving people much more powerful than you or Richard ever dreamed of being." Before Alexander could fully process this bombshell revelation, the sound of sirens began to echo in the distance, approaching rapidly. "Looks like our time is up," Marks said, already moving toward an emergency exit. "If you really want to know the truth, Mr. Mills, follow the money. Operation Phoenix is the key to everything." With these enigmatic words, The broker disappeared into the shadows, leaving Alexander with more questions than answers. The sirens were getting closer, and he knew he needed to get out of there fast. Meanwhile, at the prison, Richard was awakened in the middle of the night by agitated guards. "Montgomery, you have an urgent visitor." Confused and alarmed, Richard was taken to the visitation room, where he found Frank waiting, his face pale with concern. "What's happened?" Richard asked, feeling that something monumental was about to unfold. Frank took a deep breath before responding. Melissa unlocked the encrypted file. "Richard, we found Operation Phoenix. And that's not all. The police just arrested John Marks." Richard's world seemed to spin. Operation Phoenix, a name he had buried in the depths of his memory, now resurfaced to haunt him. With the broker's capture, he knew all the truths that had remained hidden for so long were about to come to light. The night that followed was one of tense vigil for all involved. Melissa, locked in the office, delved deeper into the secrets revealed by the file. Alexander, hiding in a cheap hotel, tried to process the broker's revelations. And Richard, in his cell, stared at the ceiling, knowing that dawn would bring a new reality for better or worse. The truth, so long sought and feared, was finally within reach. But as always, it promised to be much more complex and painful than any of them could have imagined. The dawn brought with it an unprecedented media storm. The headlines screamed in every newspaper and news portal, "Crime broker captured," "Operation Phoenix," "The scheme that shook the nation," "Montgomery," the tip of the iceberg of a national conspiracy. At the prison, Richard was awakened by the unusual buzz in the corridors. Guards spoke in agitated tones, and even the other inmates seemed to sense that something monumental was happening. "Montgomery," a guard called, opening his cell door. "You have a special hearing now." Confused and apprehensive, Richard was escorted to an interrogation room he had never seen before. Inside, to his surprise, he found not just Detective Rodriguez, but also representatives from the district attorney's office, and even a member of the FBI. "Mr. Montgomery," Detective Rodriguez began, his tone more respectful than Richard had ever heard, "we need your full cooperation. What do you know about Operation Phoenix?" Richard took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the history about to be revealed. Operation Phoenix, he began, was much more than a simple corruption scheme. It was an intricate network, connecting the underworld of organized crime with the highest echelons of political and corporate power in the country. Meanwhile, in a safe apartment provided by the police, Melissa worked tirelessly, decoding the Operation Phoenix files with the help of cybersecurity experts. Each new discovery made her gasp in surprise and horror. "My God," she murmured, looking at the computer screen. "This goes far beyond what we imagined." The files revealed a web of corruption that spanned decades, involving not just politicians and businessmen, but also judges, prosecutors, and even international agents. Operation Phoenix was, in fact, an elaborate money laundering and influence peddling scheme that moved billions of dollars annually. At the center of it all, to Melissa's shock, was a name she never expected to see: Senator Charles Mendelson, one of the most respected and influential politicians in the country, known for his supposed integrity and fight against corruption. As these revelations exploded, Alexander found himself in a precarious situation. After his encounter with the broker, he found himself being pursued not just by the police, but also by shadowy figures from the underworld. Hiding in a cheap hotel in the city's suburbs, he desperately tried to contact Daniel. Finally, after hours of attempts, he secured a safe connection. "Daniel, listen carefully," Alexander said, his voice urgent. "Your parents are alive." Operation Phoenix wasn't just about money or power. It was about control. People were erased, others were created. Your family, they were used as pawns in a much larger game. On the other end of the line, Daniel felt his world spin. Alive? But where? How? "I don't have all the answers yet," Alexander replied. "But I know they were sent out of the country, part of a protection program that was more of a prison than anything else. Daniel, we need to be careful. The people behind this, they won't hesitate to silence anyone who threatens to expose the truth." Back in the interrogation room, Richard continued his confession, each word seeming to lift a weight from his shoulders. "Senator Mendelson," he said to the shock of everyone present, "was the true mastermind behind it all. He used his reputation as a man of integrity to divert suspicion while orchestrating one of the largest criminal operations in the country's history. Detective Rodriguez exchanged worried looks with the other officers. "That's a very serious accusation, Montgomery. Do you have proof?" At that moment, as if answering the question, the door to the room opened. Melissa entered, carrying a laptop and a stack of documents. "We have all the evidence here," she declared, placing the material on the table. "Bank transactions, encrypted emails, audio recordings. Everything points to Senator Mendelsohn as the head of Operation Phoenix." As the officers pored over the evidence, Richard felt a mix of relief and apprehension. The truth was finally coming to light, but he knew the repercussions would be catastrophic. In the days that followed, the country went into a state of collective shock. High-profile arrests were made almost daily, involving politicians, businessmen, and even members of the judiciary. Senator Mendelsohn, confronted with the evidence, tried to flee the country, but was captured at the airport, in a scene broadcast live to millions of stunned Americans. Alexander, still hiding, worked tirelessly to track down Daniel's parents. His search led him to a small town in rural Argentina, where a couple lived under false identities, protected and yet prisoners of a deal made years ago. For Richard, the days in prison took on a new purpose. He became a valuable source for investigators, helping to unravel the intricate details of Operation Phoenix. His cooperation, though it wouldn't absolve him of his crimes, began to change the public's perception of him. Melissa, in turn, emerged as an unlikely hero. Her dedication to uncovering the truth, even when it meant exposing her former boss, made her a symbol of integrity for many. As more details of Operation Phoenix came to light, it became clear that the Montgomery case was just the tip of the iceberg. American society was forced to confront decades of systemic corruption, with ramifications that reached every aspect of public life. Amid all this chaos, Daniel received the news he had been waiting for. His parents had been located and were on their way back to the United States. The reunion, scheduled to take place under police protection, promised to be a moment of intense emotion, and perhaps the beginning of a healing process for many old wounds. As the sun set over a turbulent Chicago, Richard looked out the small window of his cell, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. From all-powerful tycoon to key player in exposing one of the largest corruption schemes in the country's history, his life had taken turns he could never have imagined. Operation Phoenix, like the mythical bird it was named after, had risen from the ashes of silence and oblivion, bringing with it a promise of renewal. But, as Richard well knew, the path to true redemption, both personal and national, would still be long and arduous. The reunion of the O'Connors was an event that captured the attention of the entire country. Held at an undisclosed location for security reasons, the moment when Daniel embraced his parents for the first time in over a decade was broadcast live, bringing tears to the eyes of millions of viewers. Michael and Clara O'Connor, visibly aged by the weight of years of forced exile, could hardly believe they were back in the United States, safe and reunited with their son. Daniel, in turn, alternated between sobs of joy and anxious questions, trying to fill the void of so many years apart. Richard watched the scene on the television in his cell, his heart a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Relief at seeing a family reunited, guilt for his role in separating them, and a strange sense of hope. If this reconciliation was possible, perhaps there was hope for him too. Meanwhile, in the streets of Chicago and other major cities across the country, massive protests took shape. Thousands of people, outraged by the revelations of Operation Phoenix, demanded deep changes in the political and judicial systems. Signs with the faces of Senator Mendelsohn and others involved in the scheme were burned in public squares, symbolizing the popular desire to clean up American politics. Alexander, still keeping to the shadows, worked tirelessly to ensure the safety of the O'Connors and other families affected by Operation Phoenix. His network of contacts, once used for dubious purposes, now proved invaluable in protecting key witnesses. One particularly tense evening, with protests taking over the streets of several cities, Daniel made a surprising request. He wanted to visit Richard in prison. The meeting, arranged with extreme care and under intense security, was a moment of catharsis for both. Richard, seeing the young man who had once saved him from the rubble, felt the full weight of his past actions. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice choked. "For everything." Daniel stared at him for long moments, his eyes reflecting a complex mix of emotions. "I can't say I forgive you," he finally replied. "Not yet, but I understand that you're trying to do the right thing now. And that means something." As he left the prison, Daniel felt as if a chapter of his life was finally closing. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in years, he felt hope. Operation Phoenix, which had begun as a corruption scheme, now transformed into something different, a catalyst for change, a turning point in the nation's history. And at the center of it all, unlikely allies united by a common goal: redemption. As the sun set over a nation in turmoil, the promise of a new dawn loomed on the horizon. The journey would be long and arduous, but the first step had been taken. The truth, no matter how painful, was finally coming to light. 5 years had passed since the bombshell revelations of Operation Phoenix. The United States, which had plunged into a period of turbulence and uncertainty, was slowly emerging, transformed by the storm that had swept through its institutions. On a sunny spring morning, Richard Montgomery walked out of the prison gates, a free man for the first time in half a decade. His face, marked by time and the experiences he had lived through, displayed a serenity that starkly contrasted with the arrogance that had once characterized him. Melissa waited for him, a cautious smile on her lips. "Welcome back to the world, Mr. Montgomery." Richard took a deep breath, feeling the air of freedom fill his lungs. "Just Richard now, Melissa, Mr." Montgomery stayed behind, in that meeting room where we decided to expose everything. Together they got into a modest car, a stark contrast to the luxurious limousines Richard used to ride. The drive took them through a transformed Chicago. Where there had once been billboards celebrating rampant consumerism, now there were messages of social and environmental awareness. The streets, once congested, now hosted more cyclists and efficient public transportation. "A lot has changed," Richard commented, observing the city with renewed eyes. Melissa nodded. Operation Phoenix was just the beginning. What followed, well, some call it a silent revolution. Indeed, in the years following the revelations, the United States underwent a profound transformation. The exposure of systemic corruption led to an unprecedented wave of reforms. The political system was restructured with new transparency and accountability laws. The judiciary underwent a cleanup, with corrupt judges and prosecutors being removed and replaced by a new generation committed to real justice. The car stopped in front of a modern building in the city center. "We're here," Melissa announced. As they entered the building, Richard was greeted by familiar and new faces. Alexander, now sporting completely gray hair, embraced him warmly. Frank, who continued to practice law but now focused on social causes, shook his hand with a genuine smile. But it was the presence of Daniel and his parents that truly captured Richard's attention. The boy who had saved him from the rubble years ago was now a young adult, his eyes reflecting a wisdom beyond his years. "Welcome, Richard," Michael O'Connor said, extending his hand. The gesture, laden with meaning, symbolized years of pain, forgiveness, and finally reconciliation. Richard shook the offered hand, feeling the weight of the moment. "Thank you for being here, all of you." They gathered in a conference room, where Richard was updated on the developments of the past years. The Phoenix Foundation, created with the assets recovered from the corruption operation, had become a powerful force in promoting government transparency and social development. Alexander, who led the foundation, explained, "We used the knowledge we had of the underworld to expose and prevent new corruption schemes. But more than that, we're working to change the culture, Richard. Civic education, community projects, support for ethical small entrepreneurs." Daniel, who worked at the foundation while studying law, added, "We're building bridges between communities that were once invisible to the powers that be." The project at the Aurora building, for example, turned it into a community center and incubator for social startups. Richard listened to everything with a mix of admiration and regret. "You've achieved more in 5 years than I did in my entire life of success," he reflected. Melissa, who had become an important figure in the fight against corruption, offered an understanding smile. "It's not about comparisons, Richard. Each of us played our part in this story, including you." Indeed, even from prison, Richard had continued to contribute. His revelations and guidance were crucial in dismantling deeply rooted corruption networks. His testimony in public hearings helped shape new corporate governance and business ethics policies. "And now?" Richard asked, feeling both hopeful and apprehensive about his future. It was Frank who answered, "Now you have a choice to make. The Phoenix Foundation could use someone with your knowledge and experience, but we'd understand if you wanted to take a different path." Richard looked at each face in the room, remembering the journey that had brought them there. From Daniel, the boy who had saved him twice, first physically, then morally. From Alexander, the ex-partner who had become an unlikely ally in the search for truth. From Melissa, whose loyalty had transformed into an unwavering commitment to ethics. From the O'Connors, who had found the strength to forgive the unforgivable. "I spent my life building empires of concrete and glass," Richard finally said. "Maybe it's time to build something more lasting, something that truly makes a difference." Richard's decision to join the Phoenix Foundation was met with silent approval. It wouldn't be an easy path. There was much to learn, much to prove, and an entire reputation to rebuild. But for the first time in his life, Richard felt he was on the right path. In the months and years that followed, the United States continued its journey of transformation. Operation Phoenix, which had begun as a corruption scandal, became a symbol of national renewal. Other nations, inspired by the American example, began their own processes of institutional cleanup. Richard, working side by side with those he once considered adversaries or pawns in his game of power, discovered a satisfaction that money could never buy. Each successful project, each transformed life, was a step in his own journey of redemption. On a quiet afternoon years later, Richard found himself once again before the ruins of the Aurora building, now transformed into a vibrant community center. Beside him was Daniel, no longer the frightened boy, but a confident and compassionate man. "You know," Richard said, contemplating the transformation before them, "I used to think that leaving a legacy meant having my name on imposing buildings or billionaire lists. Now I understand that the true legacy is in the lives we touch, the changes we inspire." Daniel smiled, placing a hand on Richard's shoulder. "It's funny how life turns, isn't it? That day in the rubble, I thought I was saving just one man. I didn't know I was starting a journey that would save an entire nation." As the sun set over the reborn city, Richard felt a peace he had never experienced in his days as an all-powerful tycoon. Operation Phoenix, like the mythical bird it was named after, had brought rebirth from the ashes of corruption and greed. And in that rebirth, Richard Montgomery, like the United States, had found a second chance, an opportunity to build a brighter, more just and truly rich future.